Hi everyone! Today we are going to be talking all about how to achieve a metabolic reset. Let's be real. I know many of us listening right now are in need of a metabolic reset. Some are experiencing the what did someone describe it? COVID-19 as far as like weight gain goes. And, we just, all of us kind of go through those times when we just feel like we're sluggish, we're kind of slowing down, the weight's coming on, or we feel puffy and bloated. So that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. Are my top 3 tips for boosting your metabolism and helping to shed the stubborn pounds. Now, in one of my previous talks, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I did a talk on the myths of weight loss. And I talked about how weight loss is not only about calories in versus calories out, that the body regulates weight. And in this case, I'm talking specifically about adipose tissues, so fat accumulation, that the body regulates fat accumulation just as tightly as it does anything else. Temperature, fluid regulation, electrolytes, anything else. And that is very, very accurate. Today, though, I'm going to talk about what you can do solely from a nutrition perspective to help boost your metabolism. So I'm going to talk about one of the prime aspects of metabolism, or important pieces of information when it comes to metabolism. And then I'll talk about 3 nutrition and lifestyle things that you can start doing today to increase your metabolic rate and help with encourage metabolic flexibility and either weight maintenance or weight loss. And when I say weight maintenance, some people listening might not necessarily want to lose weight, but you might suffer with, the up and down where you can gain or lose, 5 pounds in a couple days. And if you're looking to balance that, then these tips can help with that too. Okay, so talking about boosting your metabolism. One of the hallmarks of a healthy metabolism is what we refer to as metabolic flexibility. So what that means is our bodies, our easiest fuel source is glucose or sugar. And glucose is what we get, for simplicity's sake, glucose is the fuel that we obtain from carbohydrates. So when we eat carbohydrates, they're broken down in our mouth and digestive tract by enzymes into simple sugars. So that would be glucose, fructose, galactose, or the simplest forms of sugar. But for today, we're going to talk primarily about glucose. And normally when we eat, like I said, carbohydrates, protein can be converted into this, fatty acids can be converted into this, but I'm not going to try to get too techie on you guys. So simply put, we eat glucose. Our body breaks that down into simple sugars, and then the pancreas releases insulin when we eat carbohydrates. And insulin you can think of as like the lock and key. So if we've got sugar floating around in our blood, glucose, blood sugar, same thing. If we've got blood sugar floating around in our blood, insulin is released, which binds to a cell. It binds to a receptor on a cell and unlocks the door so that glucose can flow into that cell, and then we use that for energy. We convert the glucose into ATP, which is the body's energy currency, and that's how we have energy. Now, glucose is the easiest form of fuel, but it's not necessarily the cleanest burning, first of all. Second of all, when we become glucose dependent, we start having these, what we call, and there's a number of factors that influence this, stress, nutrient deficiencies, the quality of the diet, poor diet, many things that can influence it. But we normally want insulin, because insulin is a really, really key player here. Insulin, in addition to being a blood sugar balancing hormone or regulating hormone, it's also a fat storage hormone. So for example, if we eat a high sugar or high carbohydrate diet, we're keeping insulin high because it always has glucose that it has to get into the cell so we can use it for fuel. Glucose left in the cell, glucose left in the blood, especially when it starts to accumulate, is inflammatory, and it damages our cell membranes, it damages blood vessels, it damages nerve cells. So we want to get the glucose out of the blood as quickly as possible. I mean, there's always going to be some, you want it within a safe, an ideal range, optimal range. Regulate it into that range, get the rest into the cell where we can use it for energy. When the cell's energy needs are met though, any glucose remaining in the blood is converted into fat. So from that perspective, insulin is also a fat storage hormone. So when I talk about metabolic flexibility, I'm looking really strongly at insulin. And what I see all the time, and this is something I used to live with, and this was well into being a nutritionist. I ate a very healthy diet, but there were some kind of key things that were still off that was preventing me from having true metabolic flexibility. And so what I see all the time is that we're glucose dependent, first of all. Second of all, many people have insulin that is doing this roller coaster effect throughout the day. And essentially every time it's high or low, like too low, we start to perpetuate. We're actually perpetuating that fat storage process. Because insulin, when it's elevated, is also a fat storage hormone. So if insulin is either consistently staying high, and this is something that we can test, or if it's, pretty consistently tapping into those high zones, then pretty much anything that we eat will be converted into fat. And that insulin being high inhibits our ability to mobilize our own stored fat to use it for energy. It basically keeps us locked in fat storage mode versus having very well balanced, low, like optimally low insulin levels allows us to use our own fat for fuel and go longer periods of time without having glucose or food for that matter, because we can both use our own stored fat for fuel and start to dip into what's called ketosis. So the recommendations that I'm going to make today really strongly look at this process, because it starts with insulin, but it doesn't necessarily stay with insulin. We can extrapolate these benefits into thyroid hormone, into testosterone, into cortisol. So it really helps with balancing many, many aspects of our metabolism, especially from a hormonal and metabolic perspective. So getting into some of the recommendations. Starting off, as I mentioned before, many of us are locked in this kind of roller coaster effect of insulin. And what this looks like from a symptomology perspective is if you become like ravenously hungry or hangry or irritable or kind of shaky or tired or confused and like have to eat now, if you've gone more than like 3 hours without eating, anywhere from 2 to 4 hours without eating, those are some of the key signs of having insulin dysregulation. If you crave sweets anytime, or particularly after eating meals, and I talked about some of this last week too when we were talking about blood sugar in the anxiety talk, but if you crave sweets any time of day or particularly after meals, if your exercise performance is lower than you would expect it to be, like if you're training but you're not seeing weight loss or muscle gain or endurance improvements, some of these things, or if you wake up in the middle of the night hungry, if you are nauseous first thing in the morning, if you're ravenously hungry first thing in the morning, any of these can be examples of having these blood sugar imbalances. So we ideally want insulin to stay within a narrow range throughout the day. The range I like to use that I look at on lab work is between 75 and 90 glucose, fasting glucose. There's other markers that we look at on lab work to evaluate blood sugar regulation or blood sugar status, but I'm just going to start with that because a lot of people have that run through like the routine physical. Okay, so we want it to stay within a narrow range throughout the day. And when you look at how our ancestors used to eat, when food wasn't abundant, it was feast or famine, right? So we would sometimes fast for 24, 48 hours, sometimes longer, but that wasn't ideal. So fast for a period of time, and then we'd have a hunt, or we'd find, plants that we could eat, and would gorge on those as much as possible, hoard some away if possible, have some available, eat a large amount of food, and then go back and have however long until we find our next meal, okay? That is what our genetics are used to. That's what our metabolism and many of our hormones are used to. The advent of the 3 square meals per day, some of you are probably going to be surprised of where this got started. That actually got started, that has nothing to do with health. That actually got started way back at the start of the Industrial Revolution. And shift workers, people working shifts in factories, had to eat at scheduled meal times in order to swap out, with their coworkers and other employees. And so the 3 square meals came in to ensure that everyone got to eat at an appropriate time. It was more from a work perspective than it was nutrition perspective. So 3 square meals has really nothing to do with health. And especially when we start to see this whole graze throughout the day, eat more small meals than large meals, and kind of eat consistently throughout the day, same thing. That is what I was raised on for a long time. Trained on from a nutrition perspective for a long time. That was generally believed to be the best advice, especially for balancing blood sugar. Start the day with something protein-based, eat every 2 to 3 hours throughout the day, have a snack before bed. That was the understanding. But now what we see is that essentially keeps insulin kind of propped up all day long. And while we do see animals that behave that way, not really any that are necessarily in the wild that would mimic our genes. So what we want to do is, even though we have this abundance of food for the first time ever in our ancestry from a human perspective, we now have to put in effort to mimic how we used to eat and what we used to eat. So that's where, and I should say how we used to behave also from a physical perspective also. So that's where my 3 tips come in for how to effectively reset your metabolism. Okay, tip number 1 is mimicking feast and famine. And we do that through what's called intermittent fasting. I have another video out, another live talk that I did all on intermittent fasting. This was back in June. And I encourage that, again, you go find that video, join my group. That video is in there. Go find that video. I'll talk all about the different types of intermittent fasting. But in short, what intermittent fasting entails is we cycle through periods of time of feeding, followed by periods of time of fasting. And what we're accomplishing with this is, during that fasted period, there's a lot of positive changes that happen from an anti-aging perspective and longevity, to metabolism, to hormones, to oxidative stress, to cellular healing and repair. Lots of positive changes. So one of the 2 hallmarks of what happens, and this is what we're really striving for with this, is 1, our insulin levels lower. So remember, insulin only responds to when we eat food, particularly carbohydrates, to some degree protein, but we're going to focus on carbohydrates right now. And like I said before, carbs are the easiest form of fuel, but they're not the cleanest burning. So they're like kind of grade 1 gasoline as opposed to premium. They're both fine, but one, glucose, generates more free radicals and oxidative stress. It's kind of a dirty fuel in comparison to fat. Fat is a very high energy, clean burning fuel. It's like high octane fuel. But fat metabolism requires different enzymes than glucose metabolism does. So people trying to go, like, let's say ketosis, right? Because the two are kind of, ketosis is one really strong end of the spectrum that focuses on really high fat, low carb. Many people describe the low carb flu when they're transitioning into a low carb way of eating. And that's because we haven't upregulated the enzymes necessary to effectively burn fat for fuel. And so there's this kind of transitionary period where we're in this hypoglycemic state, and it's for a longer period of time than we're used to, generally only lasts 3 to 4 days. But nonetheless, it kind of creates fatigue because it takes a lot more energy to burn that fat for fuel. So it creates fatigue and almost like flu-like symptoms. But then eventually you upregulate those enzymes and you build in metabolic flexibility, and now you can burn fat more effectively and get a much higher octane fuel, which leads into feelings of mental clarity, improved mood, improved sleep, weight loss, decreased appetite, things along those lines. So that's what we're trying to accomplish with intermittent fasting. Going back to lowering insulin levels, intermittent fasting during that entire fasted period keeps insulin levels low. And when insulin is low, it signals to our cells, we actually release certain hormones that allow us to mobilize our own fat. So we break down our own fat cells and use that fat for energy. And that's exactly what we want, because not only will that obviously improve our body composition, but then when I get to point number 2, which looks at macronutrient balance, we're more well equipped to handle different types of macronutrients. So not just being dependent on carbohydrates, but now we can also handle more fat or protein and not have these blood sugar dips. The second thing that we look at with intermittent fasting is, and this kind of just piggybacks on what I was just describing, is it allows during that fasted period, again, when insulin levels are low and we're breaking down our fat for fuel, we're getting into what's called cyclical ketosis. So the goal is during that fasted period, and this is where we can kind of start to play around with the duration of which we're fasting. During that fasted period, when we're breaking down our own fat stores, what we're doing with that is we're actually turning our fat into ketones, which is a very high energy, clean burning fuel, as I was describing before. And so those things, what we refer to, well, actually I'll describe that in a minute. The third pathway by which intermittent fasting helps is what's called the mTOR pathway. And mTOR is this cellular signaling pathway within the mitochondria, which is where energy is created in each cell, that when mTOR is not activated, we're in a healing and repair state. So it allows us to break down old dysfunctional proteins, old dysfunctional mitochondria, which is actually called mitophagy, and autophagy is what I'm describing, and then build new ones, build new high functioning proteins. So it allows us to heal the body. When mTOR is activated, it puts us in a more anabolic state. So now we're building new proteins, we're building muscle, we're building tissue. And so we want a balance with mTOR. We want it sometimes to be on and sometimes to be off. And protein and glucose activate mTOR, whereas fasted states and fat do not. So intermittent fasting also, not only from a metabolic perspective, but it also helps us from a healing and repair and detoxification perspective. But from a metabolic perspective, the effect, it is the fastest way to move the needle on lowering insulin and balancing out blood sugar and allowing us to get into a fat burning mode. It's the best way of doing that. I have no other, outside of like talking about full-blown ketosis, but there's some kind of caveats to that, so I'm not going to broadcast that everybody try that on their own yet, but I will talk about ketosis here. So nonetheless, intermittent fasting, one of the best. What I encourage is start off, the goal is at least 5 days per week of the 8-16 style of fasting. So that means you eat all of your calories within an 8-hour time frame and then fast nothing but clear liquids for 16 hours, which is largely done overnight while you sleep. And I say clear liquids, that includes tea and coffee in the morning, right? Organic, high quality coffee and tea in the morning. But otherwise, so if you finish eating dinner at, let's say, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, then you would have breakfast the next day at 11 o'clock or noon. So it's more of like a breakfast lunch. 5 days per week. Secondly, if you've never done this before, and if you are one of those people that kind of becomes shaky and irritable and hangry and craves carbs or tired when you go too long without eating, work up to this. So start with 12 hours. 12 hours, if you finish eating dinner at 7, eat at 7 a.m. the next day, do that for a week or two, then try 13 hours, 14 hours, roughly a week at a time, and allow yourself to get used to it. So that would be number 1. Number 2 recommendation, so we've got intermittent fasting, number 1, 8-16 style. Actually, one more thing on intermittent fasting is once you become proficient at the 8-16 and you're doing this 5 days a week, you have for a few months, you're used to it, then, and some people will be able to jump into this faster, but then start playing around with doing one 24 to 36 hour fast per week. So what that means is a 24-hour fast would be dinner to dinner or lunch to lunch or breakfast to breakfast the next day. So if you finish eating at 6 p.m. on Monday, you would eat at 6 p.m. on Tuesday the next day. 36 hours would be 6 a.m. the following day on Wednesday. Okay. Clear beverages are okay during this. I'll sometimes have people have like broths or teas. You can do the bulletproof coffee, which is using a high fat component to coffee. So canned coconut milk, for example, or some people put butter in their coffee or coconut oil or MCT oil. Because again, remember, fat doesn't stimulate insulin or mTOR, so it still supports what we're trying to achieve. So you can do all of those things, but nonetheless, I really encourage working up to one 24 to 36 hour fast per week as a really powerful metabolic boost. It also supports detoxification and better body composition and energy and muscle healing and repair and immune healing and repair and many other things. But that's the encouragement, is work up to intermittent fasting, the 8-16 schedule, at least 5 days per week, and then play around with doing one 24 to 36 hour fast once per week. That's number 1. Second recommendation is, in addition to the intermittent fasting, incorporate what we call TLC, or time limited carbohydrates. So what we're really trying to mimic here is we're trying to get all of the benefits of ketosis, because there's many benefits to ketosis, but there's some risks associated with long-term ketogenic diets. So I'll still use ketogenic diets therapeutically, and I'm working with the person regularly, so we can check in, make tweaks if we need to. There's monitoring to make sure that we're actually getting into ketosis. There's many things that I do on top of that, which is where recommending the cyclical ketosis is much easier for even like the lay person to start doing. So what cyclical ketosis looks like is, instead of following a true ketogenic diet, which is very low carb, very high fat, done for, anywhere from generally it starts around like 3 months. Some people do it shorter, some people do it longer, but generally that's kind of the number that we're looking at. Cyclical ketosis has a lot of the same benefits of full ketosis, but it's easier, safer, and I think in a lot of ways, actually better, because it's less stress on the body. So ketosis is a state, from a health perspective and biology perspective, ketosis is a state that allows us to be fasted without going into full-on famine. So ketone bodies are formed when we combine 2 fatty acids together, and it forms a ketone body. And like I said, it only occurs in the presence of either starvation, so no calories at all, or very, very, very low carbohydrates. But ancestrally speaking, we only really got into full-on ketosis if we didn't have adequate food available. So it's still a stressor to the body. So from that perspective, cyclical ketosis, again, mimics what our genetics are used to because that's how we used to live, ancestrally speaking. So to accomplish this, we're doing the intermittent fasting, ideally 5 days per week. Time-limited carbohydrates means you eat all of your higher carbohydrate foods. So starchy vegetables like sweet potato or white potato or beets, fruit, grains, those three categories primarily. Starchy vegetables, fruit, and grains. We're eating those within one meal during the day. And then the second meal or third meal or however often you're eating during intermittent fasting, you'll notice that your appetite naturally decreases, and it's from a lot of these metabolic changes. So many people end up just having 2 meals per day. But some people have, 2 meals and a snack. So however that floats your boat. But nonetheless, point being, you have the concentrated carbohydrates in one sitting, 1 meal per day. And then the other meals or snacks around that are all lower carbs. So we're trying to keep those in like the 30, I would say 20 to 30 grams of carbs range. And then that more carb heavy meal could be closer to the between 40 to 60 range. So 1 meal per day is what has the higher carb content. So from an implementation perspective, what that might look like is you fast until 11, 12 o'clock, maybe have some coffee or tea or bulletproof coffee in the morning, fast until 11 or 12 o'clock. And then let's say that first meal is a couple of eggs scrambled with spinach and mushrooms. And then your meal, maybe you have a snack of a handful of nuts or let's see, like cucumber and guacamole, or you could have like plantain, something of lower carb. And then the one meal would be, maybe it's like a burger with sweet potato fries and a big salad or like a bunch of broccoli, or maybe a side of rice and vegetables, something along those lines. But it's one meal that's having this concentrated carbohydrates, and the rest of the eating period is lower in carb. And again, now from that perspective, not only is insulin staying low, it's essentially staying low for 90% of our day. Because if we're fasted for 16 hours, and then we're eating low carb during another, call it 4 hours, even more than that, probably closer to 6 hours. And then we have one meal that has that higher carb content. That's the one time we're going to get any kind of a significant insulin response. So if our insulin is low 90% of our day, we're dipping into those fat stores and dipping into ketosis all during that time, which allows and really builds that metabolic flexibility, regulates insulin levels, which in turn regulates our anti-aging properties and energy levels and other hormones, oxidative stress, all of these different things. So tip number 1, intermittent fasting, 8-16 style, 5 days a week. Once you're proficient at that, play around with a 24 to 36 hour fast. Some people can move into that sooner. Some people might need more time. The second recommendation is time-limited carbohydrates. So eat the carb, I don't want to say heavy meal, but the concentrated carbohydrates are consumed at 1 meal per day. The rest of the meals and snacks that are had are all lower carbs. So we're looking at like non-starchy vegetables, leafy greens, cucumbers, peppers, tomatoes, things along those lines. And nuts and seeds, protein, plant-based protein, animal protein, fats like oils and avocado and coconut, all of those perfectly fine to have any time of day. And then specifically, we're talking about grains, ideally gluten-free grains, if you know anything about me. So rice, quinoa, oats, for example. And then starchy vegetables, white potatoes, sweet potato, carrots, beets, winter squash, and fruit. Those are the 3 categories that we would have at one sitting, one meal. Okay. Next, recommendation number 3 is from a lifestyle perspective. This talks about a specific kind of exercise. The exercise is called high intensity interval training. HIIT training for short. Many of you listening are probably familiar with this, but there's a reason I'm recommending this as opposed to longer duration exercise. So before I got into nutrition, I was certified in personal training. So exercise kind of really got me into health and wellness. And in my own lifestyle choices or practices and in training and working with clients, I mean, it was always, the longer the better, essentially. The harder, the longer the better from an exercise perspective. And there's a lot to say for that. Don't get me wrong, I'm doing 10-mile backpacking trips and I love going on longer runs and yoga classes and, different things that I'm working out for an hour or more, depending on what I'm doing. There's a lot of value to that. And I should say there's a lot of value to, but there's different value when we're periodically getting our heart rate up to a very high degree, but it's only for a short term. And that's what high intensity interval training is it alternates, much like intermittent fasting, but it alternates periods of all out max effort followed by short periods of rest. So short burst intensity, period of rest. And short duration. I mean, the research shows anywhere between 7 to 12 minutes is really all that's needed. And you get the same and different benefits from HIIT training than you do from sustained endurance training. So some of the things that we see benefits from HIIT training that we see less of to a less degree with longer duration training is a boost in testosterone and growth hormone. We'll actually see stronger responses in testosterone and growth hormone from HIIT training than we would from sustained exercise. So with HIIT training, what I would encourage is two things. One, as far as timing goes. One, I would suggest doing it 3 days per week, only 3 days a week. The other days of the week, do whatever you want. So you could run, you can bike, you can swim, you can golf, you can play intramural sports, you can hike, whatever you want to do. But 3 days per week, do a form of HIIT training, and I'll get more specific on that. And then I would also encourage that 2 of those days be on your non-regimented eating days. So I mentioned doing intermittent fasting and that TLC, the time limited carbohydrates, 5 days a week. HIIT training, have it 2 of those days be on the 2 days that you're not doing that. So it's more of like a free style of eating, free form of eating. And 1 of the HIIT training days be during one of those 5 days. And the reason for this is because HIIT training, the type of exercise that it is, though it's short term, that high intensity actually is easier when we have more glucose in our system. So it'll be a little bit more challenging up front to do it on the intermittent fasting or TLC days if you're just getting used to it. I mean, at this point, I've been living this way for like 4 years. So I do HIIT training like 5 days a week. And I'll just do it first thing in the morning, and then I have my lunch later in the day. So I'm used to it. But starting off, it'll be a little bit harder. So that's why I'm saying position it accordingly. And then as you get more used to it, and because that's another part of this, is I'm going to recommend that you do the HIIT training during a fasted period. So before you've eaten anything. So ideally first thing in the morning, depending on when you're eating, but doing it in the fasted period. And so it'll take some, like you might notice the first few times you do it, it's more challenging, but then as you get used to it, you don't even notice it. Next recommendation from a HIIT training is 10 minutes max. So the style that I would recommend is 10 minutes total, and you alternate between 30 seconds on and 15 seconds off. That's what you want to work up to. So 30 seconds, all out effort. There are YouTube videos, there's apps for this that will provide workouts for you. You could do like jump squats or burpees or push-ups or plank or sit-ups, but you want something that's pretty dynamic. You can use just your body weight or some light dumbbells, maybe an exercise ball. But like I said, something that's pretty dynamic, but nothing too crazy, and you can follow one of the YouTube videos or apps for this. Nonetheless, 30 seconds, all out effort, 15 seconds of rest, like true rest. Just stand there, sit there, wait for the timer to count for 15 seconds, and then your next exercise. And within those 15 minutes, ideally get in pretty full body workout. So some push-ups, some sit-ups, some squats, some overhead shoulder presses, triceps, different really dynamic approach to working the whole body. There are many ways that you can organize HIIT training. You can do it based on like body system, but for right now, we're just going to say work the whole body. 10 minutes, 30 seconds on, 15 seconds off. If you've never done HIIT training before, you might need to start with 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, and then eventually you'll recover faster and you can move into the 30 seconds on, 15 seconds off. Okay. But from a hormonal perspective, that's where we see these really great boosts in growth hormone and testosterone, which help with, they're both anabolic, right? So they help with building muscle, burning fat, and growth hormone's great for healing and repair as well. And then, like I said, you can do the longer duration, kind of more joyful exercises the other days of the week. All right, but those three combinations, intermittent fasting, 5 days a week, 8-16, play around with a 24 to 36 hour fast once a week. Second is time-limited carbohydrates. Eat your concentrated carbohydrates, grains, fruits, starchy vegetables in one sitting per day. Have the rest of the day be lower glycemic, so non-starchy vegetables, nuts and seeds, protein, healthy fat. Concentrated carbs, one meal per day. And then the third is 3 days per week, do high intensity interval training, HIIT training, 10 minutes, full body, cycling, 30 seconds on, 15 seconds of rest. Track it. So if you start doing this, weigh yourself at the beginning. Do this consistently for a month. I encourage taking pictures and measurements and really pay attention to how your clothes fit, because you'll notice that your body composition is changing, your energy probably changes, but the scale might not. It might, but it might not. And a lot of that has to do with, probably most of you have heard that muscle weighs more than fat. And so as you're trading fat for muscle, the scale can stay the net same, even though there's a lot changing beneath the surface. But definitely track it and share your experience. Comment on here, anybody that has experience doing this, what you think about it, how it goes, and share with us, because it can be really, really profound and really awesome changes. All right, everyone. I hope that helps. As